Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into The Clue You Missed, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Clue. The clock struck midnight. A low chime echoed through the grand estate, swallowed by the thick silence that followed. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the stained glass windows like a restless spirit. Inside, beneath the flickering chandelier, a body lay motionless on the marble floor. A single drop of blood trailed from the victim's temple, clean, deliberate, no struggle, no chaos, just death, perfectly orchestrated. Inspector Japp stood over the corpse, jaw clenched. Locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. No murder weapon. He shook his head. Impossible crime, Poirot. Hercule Poirot, ever composed, smoothed the lapels of his perfectly pressed suit. His keen eyes danced across the room, absorbing details others ignored. Non, mon ami, he murmured. Not impossible, merely unseen. The suspects gathered in the drawing room, their faces masks of fear, shock, or perhaps something else. Lady Beatrice, the grieving widow, her fingers clutched around a silk handkerchief. Arthur Gainsleigh, the ambitious business partner, his gaze shifting nervously between the detectives. Evelyn Marsh, the housekeeper, standing too still, as if afraid to breathe. And Henry Whitmore, the victim's closest friend, his expression unreadable. Each had a reason to kill. Each had an alibi. The windows were locked, Japp continued pacing. The doors, secured. No one entered, no one left. And yet, he gestured at the corpse. Here he lies, dead. Poirot remained silent, eyes sweeping the room. The gleaming grand piano, the shattered whiskey glass near the fireplace, the dustless bookshelf, the portrait above the mantel, tilted, barely, a fraction of an inch, a whisper of disorder in a room of perfect symmetry. His lips pressed into a thin line. No one noticed. No one ever does. The butler found him at precisely 11:50 p.m., Japp went on. The guests were all downstairs in the dining hall, the staff accounted for. He sighed. So tell me, Poirot, who killed him and how? A murmur rippled through the room. Lady Beatrice sobbed softly. Arthur Gainsleigh wiped his brow. Henry Whitmore clenched his fists. Poirot tilted his head. There is a clue, he said softly. The room froze. A clue that should be here, but is not. Japp frowned. Meaning? Poirot turned, walking slowly toward the fireplace. He ran a gloved finger over the dusty mantel, then glanced up at the portrait above. He smiled. Curious, n'est-ce pas? What is? Japp asked. Poirot's gaze sharpened. This room is untouched. Every object precisely as it should be, except, his finger pointed, the dust. A beat of silence. Then, realization. Japp stiffened. Something was taken. Poirot nodded. A single detail. A detail so small, so insignificant, that one would never think to notice its absence. He turned sharply, eyes burning into the suspects. But it is gone. And that, mes amis, is the key to everything. The room darkened. The candlelight flickered as if the very walls exhaled a secret. Lady Beatrice's sobs quieted. Arthur Gainslee's breath hitched. Evelyn Marsh took a slow step back. Henry Whitmore's lips parted, just slightly. Japp swallowed. What was taken, Poirot? A pause. Then Poirot spoke. The missing clue was a book. A gasp. A single, sharp inhale from someone in the room. Poirot heard it. The dust on the shelf, undisturbed. Yet there is an empty space precisely where a book should be. He turned, his voice smooth, certain. Someone removed it after the murder. Someone who knew its significance. His eyes locked onto one person. And that someone is standing in this very room. The silence became unbearable. A heartbeat, a blink. Then, a sudden crash. A chair overturned. A blur of motion, as someone lunged for the door. But Poirot was faster. His arm shot out, gripping the culprit's wrist. Ah, he murmured. Not so fast, monsieur. The room erupted. Japp barked orders. The suspect struggled, eyes wild with fear. Poirot's fingers tightened. You knew the book held a secret, he whispered. A truth the victim discovered. Too late. A cold, slow realization filled the room. The air thickened, pressing in on them all. Then the final blow. Poirot's voice, calm, merciless. You did not kill to hide your crime. His gaze darkened. You killed because he found out who you truly are. The suspect's breath hitched. Their bodies sagged in Poirot's grip. And then a whisper. How? How did you know? Poirot smiled, soft, almost regretful. Because, mon ami. He glanced back at the tilted portrait, the silent witness, the final piece of the puzzle. Even the walls remember. A choked sob, a confession. The case, closed. But outside, the wind howled again, whispering secrets into the night. Secrets that perhaps were never meant to be found. Chapter 2. Murder in Plain Sight. The party was in full swing. Laughter echoed through the grand hall, glasses clinked, and music played softly in the background. A chandelier cast fractured light across the glittering guests, men in tailored suits, women draped in elegance. It was a night of indulgence, of whispered secrets and stolen glances. And somewhere, in the middle of it all, someone had just committed murder. No scream, no struggle, no chaos, just a sudden stillness. A man slumped in his chair, untouched, unseen. A glass of red wine rested in his limp hand, the liquid inside unspilled, undisturbed. His lips were slightly parted, his eyes staring at nothing. To the untrained eye, he might have appeared drunk. But Hercule Poirot knew better. The victim, Charles Montgomery, wealthy, powerful, and as it seemed, just moments ago, very much alive. The very air around his body held a dreadful stillness, yet the party raged on. No one had noticed, no one had screamed. A man had been killed in the center of a crowded room, and not a soul had seen it happen. Inspector Japp arrived moments later, his coat still dusted with the chill of the night. This is madness, he muttered, surveying the body. Poison, perhaps? His fingers hovered over the untouched wine glass. But no one saw anything. How is that possible? Poirot's sharp eyes swept the room. He saw the way guests avoided looking at the corpse, as if ignoring death would erase it. He saw the way Lady Whitmore clutched her pearls just a little too tightly, how Senator Blackwood's gaze flickered toward the exit, how the pianist's hands trembled as they hovered above the keys. And then he saw something else, something far more unsettling. The killer was here, watching. Japp turned to the suspects. no one leaves until we get to the bottom of this." His voice cut through the murmuring crowd, sending a ripple of unease. Poirot stepped forward. No forced entry, no sign of a struggle, no weapon. He paused. "Which means one thing, mon ami." He met Jap's gaze. The killer never had to enter at all. A hush fell over the room. Poirot turned to the guests, his eyes dancing across their faces like a scalpel cutting through flesh. He was killed in plain sight, and yet not one of you saw it. Lady Whitmore stammered, But he was just speaking with me. Only minutes ago." Her fingers twisted the silk of her gown. "I would have noticed." "Would you?" Poirot mused. "Or were you too preoccupied?" The senator cleared his throat. "Who would do something like this?" His voice was steady. Too steady. "And why?" Poirot smiled. Small, knowing. "That is what we shall uncover, no?" The investigation began. Questions, accusations, denials. The wine was tested. Clean. No poison. No injection marks on the body. No sign of a struggle. And yet Charles Montgomery was dead. Impossible. And yet here they were. Then Poirot saw it. The tiniest of details. Something so obvious, so utterly mundane, that it had gone unnoticed. A single button, torn from the victim's sleeve. He bent down, plucking it from the floor. "Ah," he whispered. "There it is." Jap frowned. "A button?" Poirot smiled. "No, a mistake." A shiver passed through the room. The tension tightened, the air growing heavy with anticipation. The killer had been careful, meticulous, but in their precision, they had overlooked something vital: human error. Poirot stood, holding up the button. This did not belong to the victim. His gaze flicked between the guests. "It belongs to the murderer." Lady Whitmore gasped. The senator shifted. The pianist froze. The eyes of the room bore into one another, searching, accusing. And then a breath, a single intake of air, just slightly too sharp. Poirot turned, locking eyes with the only person in the room who had not moved since. "The body was found." "You," he said softly. The pianist. A ripple of shock. The young man blinked, feigning innocence. "Me? But I was playing music the entire time. I never left the piano." Poirot's smile grew sharper. "Precisely." The room inhaled. Jap's brow furrowed. "What are you saying, Poirot?" The detective took a step closer, eyes unrelenting. "A murder in plain sight. A murder that no one saw." He tilted his head, because the killer never moved. A silence so thick it suffocated the room. The pianist's fingers twitched. Poirot continued, voice as smooth as glass. "You never left the piano, and yet the victim is dead." He lifted a hand. "Because you did not need to move." His voice dropped. "You needed only to wait." The pianist's breath hitched. Poirot turned to the others. "Tell me, mes amis, what is the one thing no one questions at a party such as this?" He let the silence stretch before answering. "The music." Jap stiffened. "Good God," Poirot nodded. The final note he played was not a note at all. He turned back to the pianist, his voice barely above a whisper. A needle, hidden within the ivory key. A touch so light, a prick so small, that the victim never felt it. The pianist swallowed, his face drained of color. The poison entered his bloodstream the moment he leaned over to request a song, Poirot said. By the time he sat back down, he was already dead. A beat of silence. Then, an exhale. The pianist's shoulders slumped. A single tear rolled down his cheek. And then, the final confession. I never meant. His voice broke. He ruined my life. His hands curled into fists. He had to pay. Poirot watched as the pianist was taken away, the weight of justice settling upon the room like a heavy fog. No one spoke. No one moved. The reality was suffocating, because the truth was more terrifying than the mystery. Murder in plain sight, and no one saw it. Chapter 3. The Red Herring Trap. The rain lashed against the cobblestone streets, turning the city into a mirror of black water and fractured light. The body lay face down in the alley, rain pooling around it like ink spilling from an untold story. A man, wealthy, well-dressed, dead. His lifeless hand clutched a crumpled note, its edges soaked and unreadable. A silver pocket watch, still ticking, sat beside him. Time of death? Not long ago. Inspector Japp exhaled, shaking his head. Another one. Hercule Poirot stood beside him, unmoved by the storm, his eyes tracing the crime scene with the precision of a sculptor studying stone. Tell me, mon ami, he murmured, what do you see? Japp sighed. Same as you. A businessman, alone, murdered in an alley. A robbery gone wrong. He glanced at the note in the dead man's grasp. Or a warning. Poirot bent down, his fingers hovering just above the body, his gaze locked on to the pocket watch. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. Instead, he whispered, curious. Japp frowned. What? Poirot straightened, his expression unreadable. This is not the first. Japp stiffened. The weight of his words settled over the crime scene, like fog. 3 murders in 3 weeks. Different locations, different methods, but one constant. A single clue left behind. The first, a playing card. The second, a torn theater ticket. And now, a note. Each a breadcrumb, leading down a path that felt too neat, too deliberate. The suspects, a tangled web of deception. Eleanor Ashford, the grieving widow of the first victim. Wealthy, connected, dangerous. Thomas Reed, a journalist who arrived at every crime scene before the police. An informant, or something else. Victor Harrow, a gambler drowning in debt, seen arguing with the second victim the night before his death. And then there was Sebastian Wells, an old friend of the deceased, his name scrawled in the victim's address. Book underlined twice. Suspicious. Japp rubbed his temples. One of them is playing us, Poirot. Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. Ah, yes. But which one? The investigation spiraled. The widow sobbed, claiming innocence. The journalist smirked, too confident. The gambler flinched at every question. And Wells. Wells never blinked. Then came the break. The note, once dried, revealed a single word. Betrayal. It sent the investigation into chaos. Eleanor had an affair. Reed had blackmailed the second victim. Victor owed money to the first. Wells had lied about his alibi. Suspicions shifted. Accusations flew. And then the biggest twist. A witness, a young boy, a street vendor, claimed he had seen the killer. A man wearing a dark coat, leaving the alley just before the body was found. A man who matched the description of Victor Harrow. Japp didn't hesitate. We've got him. Poirot, however, said nothing. Victor was arrested. The case, seemingly closed. The evidence lined up too perfectly, the story neat, the motive clear. And yet something lingered. A whisper at the back of Poirot's mind. The kind of whisper that spoke of mistakes. That night, Poirot sat alone, staring at the case files. He traced his fingers over the photographs, the notes, the so-called evidence. And then he saw it. The red herring. The clue that had misled them all. The pocket watch. The time frozen at 10:15. The exact time of death. Too exact, too clean. A planted clue. His breath slowed, his heart steadied, and a single, undeniable truth settled in his bones. They had arrested the wrong man. Morning came with a storm of urgency. Poirot rushed to the station, demanding Victor's release, but it was too late. The suspect was found in his cell, dead. A suicide, they said. Guilt, they assumed. Poirot knew better. The real killer had watched, waited, and when the trap had sprung, they had silenced the only loose end. He stood in the rain, staring at the city that had swallowed another life. His hands curled into fists. He had been outplayed, but not for long, because now he knew one thing for certain. The murderer was still out there, and this time, Poirot would set the trap. Chapter 4. A Whisper in the Dark. The house stood at the edge of the cliff, battered by the relentless wind. The ocean raged below, black waves crashing against jagged rocks. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something else. Something rotten. Something wrong. The candles flickered violently, as though trying to warn them. A woman was dead. Her body lay at the foot of the grand staircase, her limbs twisted unnaturally, eyes wide, lips parted, in a silent scream. The velvet carpet beneath her soaked in deep crimson. And yet there was something else, something far more unsettling. Her mouth, stained black. Poirot knelt beside her, his expression unreadable. This was no ordinary poison, he murmured. His fingers hovered above her lips, careful not to touch. This was meant to send a message. Inspector Japp stood rigid, fists clenched. A message? His voice was tight, laced with unease. Poirot exhaled softly. The color. It is belladonna. Deadly nightshade. His eyes darkened. A whisper of death. The room held its breath. The suspect stood in the dim light, shadows casting long across the walls. Henry Blackwood, the husband, cold, detached. His hands trembled, but his gaze did not. Margaret Henshaw, the maid, her face pale, her body stiff. A woman who had seen too much. Oliver Kent, the business partner, the man with everything to gain. His lip curled in barely concealed contempt. And then there was Eleanor, the sister. She did not weep. She did not flinch. She only watched. Japp paced. The house was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. He glanced at the body, his jaw tightening. And yet, someone did this. Poirot's gaze swept the room. The flickering light, the trembling hands, the truth lurking just beneath the surface. She knew something, he said softly. Henry stiffened. What are you implying? Poirot's eyes never left him. That she was silenced before she could speak. Silence. A gust of wind howled through the cracks in the walls. A candle guttered out, plunging the room into deeper shadows. And then, a whisper. Soft, barely there, but unmistakable. Japp froze. What was that? No one moved. No one breathed. Poirot turned his head slightly. Did you hear it? His voice was almost amused. Another whisper. This time, closer. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her body shuddering. It's the house, she choked out. It's this cursed house. Poirot stood slowly, smoothing his coat. No. His voice was calm. It is not the house. His gaze turned to the body once more. It is her. The whispering grew louder, a rustling, a murmur just beyond reach. Japp took an uneasy step forward. Poirot, what the hell is... Then it stopped. Poirot reached down, slipping a gloved hand beneath the dead woman's collar. A shiver ran through the room as he pulled something free. A note, crushed, hidden beneath fabric, written in shaking, frantic scrawl. His eyes flickered over the words, and then he smiled. "She was afraid," he murmured. "But not of who you think." The room tensed. Japp frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot turned, holding up the note. "This is not a confession. This is a warning." His voice dropped. "She was never supposed to die." A heartbeat, a shift in the air, a weight pressing against the walls, and then the final revelation. She was trying to save someone else. The room erupted. Voices clashed. Protests flew. "She was lying," Henry shouted. "She didn't know anything," Oliver barked. "Please stop this," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. Poirot's gaze landed on her. His voice was soft, almost kind. "It was never meant to be her, was it?" The words hung, thick, suffocating. Eleanor's breath hitched. The candlelight caught the sheen of sweat on her brow. Poirot took a step closer. She knew someone else was in danger. She tried to stop it, and so... His voice dropped. "You made sure she couldn't." A sharp inhale. Eleanor trembled. Her fingers clenched at the fabric of her dress. "No," she whispered. Poirot's eyes were unrelenting. "Yes." Japp's face hardened. "You knew the real target all along." A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek. "I didn't want this." Poirot sighed. "But you let it happen." The truth settled over them, heavier than death. The real murder had yet to happen. The note, the whisper in the dark, the secret that changed everything. Someone else was going to die, and they were running out of time. Chapter 5. The Impossible Alibi. The body was found in the study, slumped over the mahogany desk, a single bullet lodged between the eyes. The air reeked of gunpowder. The window was shut. The door was locked from the inside. No footprints, no forced entry. A perfect crime. A murder that shouldn't have been possible. Inspector Japp ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. 5 people in this house, 5 suspects, and not a single one could have done it. Hercule. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, his sharp eyes sweeping the room. He had solved impossible cases before, but this was something else. The victim, William Harrow, had been a powerful man, ruthless, wealthy, hated. The list of enemies stretched far beyond the walls of his estate. But the suspects, the 5 people who had been inside the house when he died, they each had an alibi so airtight it seemed unbreakable. His wife, Eleanor Harrow, had been in the dining room, surrounded by servants. His brother, Arthur Harrow, had been playing billiards with the family lawyer. The maid, Clara, had been downstairs in the kitchen, preparing tea. The butler, Mr. Graves, had been in the wine cellar, inventorying bottles. And the final guest, Theodore Lane, a business associate, had been on the front lawn, speaking to a gardener. Not one of them could have fired the fatal shot, and yet one of them had. Japp gritted his teeth. It's impossible. No one was near the study when the gun was fired. The door was locked from the inside. It's as if... He hesitated, rubbing his temples. As if the gun fired itself. Poirot shook his head. Non, mon ami. A trick. A deception. He walked toward the desk, eyes narrowing. The victim's hand was curled slightly, almost as if... He stopped. Then he smiled. Tell me, Japp, Poirot said softly. Where is the gun? Japp frowned. That's the strangest part. It's missing. Poirot nodded. Exactement. His fingers traced the edge of the desk, where a faint smudge of dust had been disturbed. And yet we know it was fired here, in this very room. Silence. The sound of rain tapping against the window. The suspects stood tense, their faces masks of fear, confusion. Arthur crossed his arms. Are you saying the murderer walked out of the study, locked the door behind them, and vanished into thin air? His voice was laced with frustration. Poirot chuckled. Not at all. He turned to the group, his expression unreadable. You see, the killer never left the study. A sharp inhale, a flicker of panic in someone's eyes. Japp frowned. But we searched the room. Poirot raised a finger. Ah, you searched for a person. He gestured to the corpse. You did not search for an illusion. The tension thickened. Poirot moved toward the bookshelf. He reached out, pressed lightly on a wooden panel. Click, a hidden compartment slid open, and inside, a gun. Still, warm. A gasp echoed through the room. Eleanor clutched her pearls. What does this mean? Poirot picked up the weapon, turning it in his hands. It means the victim did not fire it himself, but neither did the killer fire it and walk away. He exhaled, because the shot was fired before the door was ever locked. A murmur of confusion rippled through the room. Japp's brow furrowed. Then, how the hell? Poirot placed the gun back into the compartment. A string, he said. Simply, a simple mechanism attached to the trigger, a delayed shot. The killer set it up, left the room, and when the string pulled tight, bang. He gestured toward the door. By then, they were already outside, making their alibi airtight. The realization crashed over them. The impossible alibi was no longer impossible. It was murder by design. Japp's gaze swept the room. Which means, his voice darkened. One of you set the trap. Silence. Poirot turned, his eyes piercing. And I know who. Every breath in the room seemed to halt. He let the moment stretch, watching, waiting. Then he spoke the name. Theodore Lane. The businessman stiffened. This is ridiculous, Poirot smiled. Is it? The air crackled. Poirot took a slow step forward. You were outside, speaking to the gardener, were you not? Theodore lifted his chin. Yes. Poirot nodded. And yet, his eyes gleamed. Not once did you ask how the victim died. A beat of silence, a shift in the room's energy. Japp inhaled sharply. Bloody hell! Theodore's hands curled into fists. Poirot didn't let him finish. Because you already knew. His voice was quiet, certain. You set the trap. You left the study. You created an alibi, so perfect, so untouchable, that no one would ever suspect you. His voice softened. But you made one mistake. Theodore's throat bobbed as he swallowed. What mistake? Poirot's eyes gleamed with triumph. You tried too hard to be innocent. A pause. Then, Theodore bolted. A chair crashed. A shout rang through the air. Japp lunged, grabbing his arm, forcing him down. Theodore fought, struggled, but it was over. As he was dragged away, his voice cracked. I had no choice. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. Ah, monsieur, there is always a choice. The weight of the truth settled in the room, thick, suffocating. The impossible crime had been solved. But the cost of its revelation was a broken man, dragged away in the rain, his perfect crime undone by a single whispering floor. Poirot turned to Jap, his voice quiet. Justice, mon ami, always finds a way. Chapter 6. A glove, a clock, a lie. The body lay on the cold marble floor, motionless, lifeless. A single bullet wound to the chest. The gun, nowhere to be found. The crime scene was meticulous, too meticulous. Nothing was overturned, no signs of struggle. Just death, carefully placed, deliberate, controlled. Poirot knelt beside the corpse, his fingertips hovering over the details that everyone else would miss. The clock on the fireplace mantel had stopped at precisely 11:06 p.m. A man's glove, leather, dark, lay discarded beside the victim's outstretched hand. And on the desk, a letter, torn, ripped in half, as if the truth inside had been too dangerous to remain whole. Inspector Jap rubbed his temples. It should be straightforward, but it's not, is it? His voice carried the weight of exhaustion. Poirot did not answer. Instead, his eyes moved carefully, his mind a machine in motion. The suspects stood tense in the grand room, each one watching, the other waiting for someone to speak, to slip, to reveal what they should not. Margaret Winslow, the victim's grieving fiancée, trembling hands clasped together, her pearl necklace taut around her throat. Edward Sinclair, the business partner, cool and composed, but his eyes flickered once, twice, toward the door, as though calculating his escape. Graham Hollis, the butler, stiff and silent, standing too perfectly still, as if afraid to breathe. Vivian Hart, the victim's sister, arms crossed, a deep bruise forming on her wrist, a bruise no one had asked about. Poirot straightened. "Mes amis," he said softly, "let us play a game, shall we?" The room tensed. Poirot lifted the glove. A man's glove. But the victim, you see, did not own such a pair. His eyes flicked toward the suspects, gauging their reactions. Curious, is it not? Edward Sinclair exhaled sharply. It could belong to anyone. A visitor. A mistake. Poirot smiled, but his eyes remained sharp. Perhaps. Then he gestured toward the clock, a timepiece, shattered at 11:06 p.m., the supposed moment of death. His fingers traced the edge of the glass. And yet, I wonder, does time truly stop so conveniently? Jap frowned. You're saying it was staged? Poirot turned the clock in his hands. A clever trick, a deception. He met Jap's gaze, one meant to mislead. Silence, a shift in the air. Someone's breath quickened. Poirot walked to the desk, lifting the torn letter. And this. His voice dropped, almost a whisper. A final message, ripped apart. His thumb brushed over the ink-stained paper. Half of a truth is more dangerous than a whole lie. Margaret's lip quivered. It doesn't mean anything. Just some old letter. Poirot turned to her. Does it not? She flinched. Jap stepped forward. All right, Poirot. Enough riddles. We've got 3 clues. A glove, a clock, a torn letter. What do they tell us? Poirot was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke. They tell us everything. The words sent a ripple of unease through the room. Poirot turned slowly, his voice almost mournful. The glove belongs to a man who was never here. The clock is broken at a time that is convenient, but not true. And the letter, the letter. His fingers traced the torn edge. The letter was never meant to be read at all. A pause, a breath, a beat of silence, heavy enough to shatter glass. And then Poirot locked eyes with Vivian Hart. "You killed him." The words sliced through the room like a blade. Vivian's breath caught. Jap's eyes widened. "What?" Poirot stepped closer, his voice low, unforgiving. "The glove. It was planted. A distraction. The real clue was the clock." He turned toward the fireplace, his hand resting on the mantel. "It was broken after the murder to mislead us." His gaze snapped back to Vivian. "But you made a mistake." Vivian swallowed. "This is absurd." Poirot ignored her. "You see, my dear, the letter—" He lifted the torn paper once more. It was never torn in rage. It was torn in fear. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Poirot's voice softened. "Your brother found out, didn't he? He discovered the truth. That the man he was about to marry his fiancée to," his eyes flickered toward Edward, "was already promised to someone else." Margaret gasped. Edward's face paled. "What are you talking about?" Vivian closed in her eyes. Poirot exhaled. "She loved you, Edward, and you betrayed her." His voice was nearly a whisper. "And so, she took everything from you." Vivian's body trembled. Her lips parted, but no words came. Poirot's voice did not waver. "You killed your brother because he was going to stop the wedding. You broke the clock to mislead us. You planted the glove to blame another." A beat. "And you tore the letter because it held the truth." Vivian let out a breath. A sharp, broken sound. The room felt colder, heavier, the truth pressing down like an iron weight. Poirot's voice was gentle. "You loved him, and in the end, you lost him." Tears slid down her cheeks. A single nod. Jap inhaled. "My God." The cuffs clicked around her wrists. She didn't fight, didn't protest. As they led her away, she turned to Poirot, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted him to be happy." Poirot's eyes softened. "But happiness built on a lie always ends in tragedy." The door closed behind her. The room was silent once more. Jap exhaled. A glove, a clock, a lie. He shook his head, and we almost fell for it. Poirot stared at the broken clock, the time frozen forever at 11:06 p.m. And then he whispered, "Almost." Chapter 7. The Dead Man Speaks. The body was found in the study, slumped over the desk, his lifeless hand still gripping a fountain pen. Blood pooled beneath him, thick and dark, staining the parchment beneath his fingertips. A single bullet to the heart. Swift. Final. The window was open, the cold night air creeping in, making the chandelier above flicker. The scene was chilling in its stillness, a crime frozen in time. Inspector Japp rubbed his temples, his breath heavy with frustration. Shot at close range. No sign of forced entry. The doors were locked from the inside. He gestured toward the window. "But the drop is 30 feet down. No way out." His voice darkened. "A locked room murder, Poirot, and I don't have a damn clue." Poirot stood beside the desk, his keen eyes scanning the room, absorbing every detail. He did not speak. Not yet. His gaze flickered from the bullet wound to the scattered papers, then to the ink-stained fingers of the dead man. Something was wrong. The suspects were gathered in the drawing room, their faces tight with tension, hands clasped, eyes darting. Each one had a motive. Each one had an alibi. And yet someone had pulled the trigger. Catherine Blackwood, the grieving wife, her veil pulled tightly over her pale face. Too composed, too careful. Lawrence Ashford, the business partner, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair, his leg bouncing, a nervous tell. Thomas Reed, the family lawyer, his briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield. He had always protected the victim, but what if this time he hadn't? Eleanor Wells, the housemaid, her face blotched with tears, her hands trembling, the only one who wept. But was it grief or guilt? Japp exhaled sharply. The will is missing. The safe is open. It's clear what this was about. He looked at Poirot. Isn't it? Poirot tilted his head slightly. Is it ever so simple, mon ami? He turned back to the body, his sharp gaze settling on the most peculiar detail of all, the ink. The victim had been writing something before he died. But the ink, it was smeared, as if his dying hand had dragged across the page. Poirot reached forward, carefully lifting the paper. The words were barely legible, but there was something beneath the ink stains, something hidden beneath the sprawl of ink and desperation. A name. But before he could read it, a gust of wind rushed through the open window, scattering the papers into the air. The room gasped. The truth had just slipped through their fingers. Japp cursed. Bloody hell, can you make it out? Poirot remained calm. He lifted one of the fallen pages from the floor, his fingers gliding over the wet ink. And then he smiled. Ah, he murmured. Our victim. He speaks. The suspect stiffened. Japp frowned. What do you mean? Poirot turned, holding up the stained paper. This was no robbery. This was no crime of passion. This was a man who knew he was about to die. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Poirot continued, his voice smooth, deliberate. He was writing a name, his killer's name, but he was interrupted. He lifted the page higher, letting the candlelight catch the smeared ink. And in his final moments, with what little strength he had left, he made sure that the truth remained. A sharp inhale from Catherine, a flicker of panic in Lawrence's eyes. Poirot's gaze swept over them all. Ink can be smeared. Words can be lost. He turned back to the desk. But actions, mon ami, actions cannot be erased. He pointed to the desk drawer. Open it. Japp hesitated, then yanked it open. Inside, a single item, a voice recorder. The breath left the room. Poirot reached for it, pressing play, and then a voice, the victim's voice, weak, labored. If you are hearing this, I am dead. Catherine let out a strangled gasp. Japp stiffened. Good God. The recording crackled. The man's voice grew more strained, more desperate. I know who you are. I trusted you. A pause, a ragged breath, and now you will burn for this. The room felt like it was closing in, and then a single name. The dead man spoke his final truth. The killer's name rang through the room like a bullet. The reaction was instant. Lawrence bolted. A chair crashed. Japp lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar, forcing him down. Lawrence struggled, his face pale, his breath ragged. No, no. But it was over. Japp tightened the cuffs around his wrists. You bloody fool. He was dying, and you let him tell the world. Lawrence's body sagged, his perfect plan undone by a single desperate message. Poirot exhaled, adjusting his cuffs. You see, mon ami, the dead do speak. A haunting silence followed. Catherine trembled. The housemaid sobbed. And Lawrence? He simply stared at the floor, knowing that the truth had spoken louder than his lies ever could. Chapter 8. The clue hidden twice. The room was cold, dark. Shadows crept across the walls as the candle flickered, casting long, jagged lines on the floor. The victim, a man of considerable wealth and power, lay sprawled on the floor, his body cold as the chill in the air. The cause of death? A single stab wound to the heart. Clean, precise, efficient. There were no signs of a struggle, no chaos, no bloodshed, just death, lying in wait. And yet, there was something that didn't fit. Poirot stood over the body, his eyes scanning every inch of the room. It was too perfect. The bloodstain, the position of the victim's hand, the chair that had tipped over, everything was just wrong enough to make him question what was real. Inspector Japp looked around the room, his frustration palpable. It doesn't make sense, Poirot. There are no signs of forced entry. The windows are locked, the doors were bolted from the inside, and the victim had no enemies, none that we know of. Poirot's lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. You see, mon ami, that is the problem. It's too perfect. Someone wanted it to be this way. He walked slowly across the room, his eyes methodically flicking from one detail to the next. Japp followed, his brow furrowed. Someone staged this? A perfect crime? Poirot didn't respond. Instead, he reached the victim's desk and picked up a letter. It was creased, the edges worn, as if someone had read it over and over again. Perhaps it's the letter that holds the key. Poirot's voice was soft, but firm. Japp's eyes narrowed. A letter? But there's nothing written here. Poirot smiled. That is the first clue. Japp raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Poirot turned the letter over and held it up to the light. There, faint but visible, was a series of numbers scrawled in pencil. A code, he murmured, more to himself than to Japp. Do you see it now? Poirot's voice was sharp, his gaze intense. Japp looked closer, his eyes widening. It's a cipher, a code, but why would the killer leave that behind? Poirot looked at him, the flicker of realization in his eyes. Because it was meant to be overlooked. As Poirot continued to examine the room, he paused at the victim's bookshelf. A single book, slightly askew, caught his eye. He reached for it, pulling it free from the shelf with a slow, deliberate motion. Inside the cover, there was another faint clue, another code, a string of numbers. Japp's heart skipped. Wait, it's the same code as the letter. Poirot nodded slowly. Exactly, the same cipher. But what makes this truly interesting, mon ami, is that the victim never intended for us to find it. It was a clue, hidden twice. Japp blinked. Twice? Poirot turned to face him. You see, the victim didn't want anyone to solve his murder. He wanted to make sure it remained a mystery, and so he hid the clue right before his death. He believed the code was the key to his salvation. But he was wrong. The code, in fact, would lead us down the wrong path entirely. The silence that followed was thick, and then it hit Japp. The victim. He knew the killer. He was trying to send us a message. Poirot's eyes darkened. The message was never meant to be found, until now. He looked at the bookshelf again. A book, a letter, and a hidden code. The victim thought he could fool us with the most obvious clues, but the truth was right in front of us all along. A sudden realization struck Japp. The second clue. How did we miss it? Poirot turned to face the room again, his eyes scanning every inch. The answer was always in plain sight, mon ami, a detail so obvious it was overlooked. Japp's breath caught. He turned back to the body, to the way the victim had collapsed against the desk. But how? How did he know? Poirot's lips curled into a grim smile. He didn't know. He just made sure the killer couldn't hide. The room was silent as Poirot finally turned back to the cipher. He picked up a piece of paper, his pen gliding across it as he worked quickly. The code, Jap. It tells us more than we realize. Minutes passed. Poirot's hand moved with a fluid precision, unraveling the cipher that had been buried for so long. As the final letters clicked into place, the words on the page became clear. The killer is the one who has always been beside you. The one you trust. The one you never suspect. Jap's heart pounded. No, it can't be. Poirot's gaze flicked to the room's last suspect. Yes, Jap. It's the one we trusted all along. Eleanor, the victim's wife, stood frozen by the door, her eyes wide with shock. No, she whispered, trembling. It can't be me. Poirot's voice was cold. But it is. You killed him, Eleanor, and you thought no one would ever know. Her breath hitched as the room seemed to close in on her. I never meant to. I loved him. Her voice trembled, tears spilling from her eyes. But he was going to leave me. He was going to expose everything. Everything I've done. Poirot took a step forward, his voice low and controlled. You thought you could hide behind the clues, behind the codes. But the truth is, Eleanor, you were hiding in plain sight all along. The silence that followed was suffocating, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then Jap let out a breath, finally understanding the depth of the deception. The killer wasn't some stranger. The killer was the one who had been closest all along, the one no one had suspected. Eleanor was arrested. The room stood still, and the truth settled heavily on their shoulders. A clue hidden twice. So obvious, so close, and yet no one had seen it until it was too late. Chapter 9. The Face in the Mirror. The storm raged outside, its fury battering the windows as the clock ticked past midnight. Inside, the mansion stood in eerie silence, every shadow hanging heavy, as if it held a secret. The atmosphere was thick, charged with an undeniable tension. Poirot stood in front of the grand mirror in the foyer, his reflection gazing back at him. It was a beautiful mirror, antique, framed with intricate carvings, the kind that seemed to whisper stories if you listened long enough. But tonight, it wasn't the beauty of the mirror that caught Poirot's attention. It was the feeling of something being off, something hidden just beneath the surface. Inspector Jap, Poirot spoke softly, breaking the silence. Come here. Jap walked over, his heavy boots echoing in the stillness of the mansion. His eyes followed Poirot's gaze, landing on the mirror. What is it, Poirot? Poirot's eyes narrowed, and his fingers lightly traced the edge of the mirror. He said nothing at first, then, with an almost imperceptible gesture, he pointed at the reflection, at a detail that should have been impossible. Jap frowned. What am I looking at? Poirot turned, his voice calm, but with a hidden fire. Look closely at the reflection. Jap's eyes shifted to the mirror again, then widened in disbelief. No, that's not possible. In the reflection of the mirror, a face appeared. Faint at first, barely visible, but unmistakable. The face of someone they thought they knew, someone who had been in the room the entire time. The figure was of Eleanor Blackwood, the victim's wife, but something was wrong. The reflection was too perfect, too precise. Eleanor stood just behind Poirot, but in the mirror, her eyes were cold, emotionless, almost as if she were staring directly into the camera, into Jap's very soul. Jap took a step back, his heart pounding. This isn't right. How could it? Poirot's eyes remained fixed on the mirror. There is no such thing as coincidence, mon ami. Suddenly, the room's temperature dropped. The candlelight flickered and then went out completely, leaving them in complete darkness. A low, guttural sound echoed through the mansion, something not quite human. A sharp, heavy breath filled the void, and then a voice, soft but clear, "Don't trust her." It was Eleanor's voice, but it wasn't. It was a whisper, distorted, as if from another time or place, a voice from the other side. Jap's heart skipped. "Poirot, what is happening?" Poirot stepped away from the mirror, his face pale, his expression taut with focus. "The truth is more dangerous than we think. Eleanor, she is not who she says she is." Before Jap could react, the mirror began to shimmer. The air grew thick, and the surface of the mirror rippled like water, warping the reflection of Eleanor. Suddenly, her image was gone, replaced by something darker. A new face appeared in the glass, one that had been there all along. It was Eleanor's, but her face was older, scarred, and twisted in a way that made Jap's stomach turn. Poirot's eyes locked on to the reflection with grim realization. "The person you have been trusting, Jap, has been lying to us all." Jap took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. "What? No, it can't be." Poirot's voice was grave, his words cutting through the tension. "The woman we thought we knew was never Eleanor Blackwood. The real Eleanor died long ago." The reflection in the mirror grinned, its features contorting into something unrecognizable, as if mocking them, daring them to understand the truth. Jap's mind reeled. But how? How could this be possible? Poirot's eyes darkened. "It was all a lie, Jap, a carefully constructed facade. The woman standing before us now is not the widow, but the woman who replaced her, someone with a past as dark as this mansion itself." Jap turned to Eleanor, his voice shaking. Who are you?" Eleanor's smile twisted into something sinister. "Who I am doesn't matter anymore. The question is, who are you?" Her voice echoed, and for a moment, the air felt suffocating. Poirot stepped closer. "You were never Eleanor Blackwood. You were her twin sister, Vanessa. You murdered her years ago and took her place. No one suspected you because no one knew the truth." The room was silent. The truth hung in the air like smoke, filling every corner of the space. Vanessa's face twisted in an expression of twisted satisfaction. "You're too late, Poirot. I've played this game for far too long. I became Eleanor because no one would suspect a widow of murder. But it was never about inheritance. It was about power, about control." Jap's hands shook as he looked at Poirot. But why? Why all of this?" Poirot's voice was cold, his expression impenetrable. "The truth was always in front of us, Jap. The reflection, distorted and warped, was the first clue. It showed us the face beneath the mask." Vanessa sneered. "A mask, a reflection. You think you've uncovered the truth, but you've merely scratched the surface. What you've uncovered is my revenge." Her smile faltered for a brief moment, and for the first time, a hint of vulnerability appeared in her eyes. "Eleanor didn't deserve to die. I deserved everything she had." The realization struck like a thunderclap. Vanessa hadn't killed for wealth or status. She had killed for something far more dangerous, for herself. The twisted obsession to become someone else had consumed her, and in the process, she had destroyed everything in her path. Poirot's face softened with sorrow. "No one wins when they live a lie, madame. And just like that, the weight of the truth settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. Vanessa, the woman behind the mask, the true killer, stood before them, unmasked but still hauntingly hidden in her own reflection. The mirror cracked, and in that moment, as the pieces of glass fell to the floor, the true horror of Vanessa's deception was fully revealed. Chapter 10. Poirot's last question. The room was suffocating, silent. The tension hung in the air like a fog, thick and almost tangible. 5 faces stared at Hercule Poirot, each of them sweating, eyes darting nervously, minds spinning in the web of their own lies. They had no idea how much they had already revealed. The murder had been complicated. 5 suspects, each with an alibi that seemed unbreakable. Each of them had motives, yes, but no clear reason why the victim had been murdered. No clear answer. Until now. Poirot's gaze swept across the room, his eyes sharp, calculating. He didn't need to speak much. His silence was louder than anything he could say. The clock ticked, each second heavier than the last. His mind was moving, piecing together the puzzle. A piece here, a clue there. One final question would unravel it all. I see, now. Poirot finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, but with a cold authority that sent a ripple through the room. The truth is, right in front of us. Everyone shifted uncomfortably. Japp stood next to him, his face pale. He had been watching Poirot work through the case with quiet amazement, seeing the great detective move through each twist and turn like an artist at his easel. Poirot raised an eyebrow, taking a deliberate step forward. You think the killer is among us? Japp blinked. The room fell silent. You do think that, don't you? Poirot asked, his voice lowering, almost too soft to hear. One of you has lied, yes. But who? A chill ran through the group, their faces tightening, unsure if Poirot had already solved the case or was about to shatter their lives with one simple observation. They didn't know. They couldn't know. Poirot paused. The silence was unbearable. The weight of the moment hung over them all. And then, with surgical precision, he asked, "But did you hear the one thing you should have?" Everyone froze. A shiver of realization swept across the room. What did he mean? Poirot glanced at each suspect, his eyes drilling into them, dissecting their every move. You've been so focused on what you think is important. The alibis, the motives, the clues. But you missed the one thing that could tell us everything. He moved closer to the center of the room, his presence like a magnetic force pulling everyone toward him. Tell me, Poirot continued, how did the victim know? For a split second, no one spoke. The room felt as though it had frozen in time. Then something shifted in the air. A sharp breath from Eleanor, a twitch of a hand from Arthur. Poirot was still. No one asked this, did they? No one thought it was important. He turned to them, eyes narrowing with cold brilliance. The victim knew who was going to kill him. But how? The room was silent. The truth was right in front of them. Poirot's eyes flicked toward the window. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass. The clock ticked louder, as though urging them to see it, to understand. Japp, unable to contain himself any longer, whispered, "What are you saying, Poirot?" Poirot turned to him, his face unreadable. The victim. He knew the killer. He knew their every move. The question, Japp, was not who did it. The question was when. The room went still. Poirot smiled faintly, his voice a whisper. He knew because he set it up. A perfect murder. a perfect trap. He told them. He told them everything they needed to hear, and that is how he died. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The victim had known who would kill him. He had orchestrated his own death. But the moment of truth, the one detail they'd all missed, was so simple, so subtle, that it had slipped through their fingers. The room's air seemed to thicken, and the truth slowly settled in like a vice. The murderer wasn't someone with a grudge. It wasn't a business partner gone wrong. It was the victim himself. Poirot turned sharply to Eleanor. "You did hear it. You heard him, didn't you?" Her face blanched. She shook her head desperately. I don't understand. I didn't. Poirot's eyes darkened. You knew what he was going to say. You knew it all along." He stepped closer, his voice sharp as a blade. "You were the one he wanted to confess to. You were the one who needed to hear it." The truth hit her like a weight. Her lips parted, her eyes glassy with disbelief. "No," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to end like this." Poirot's last question shattered everything. "Did you really think you could escape the truth?" Eleanor's face crumpled, and the weight of her lies and her guilt crashed down on her. As the room descended into chaos, the answer they had all been searching for, the truth they had failed to see, now laid bare. Poirot's final question had unraveled everything. And now, in the crushing silence that followed, no one could deny the devastating truth. The victim had known. The victim had orchestrated it all. And the killer was standing right there in front of them, hidden in plain sight. Eleanor had killed him, but not for vengeance. No, she had killed him because she needed to be free of the truth, of the person she had once been. She had hidden behind a lie so long that she'd convinced herself it was real. But Poirot knew. Poirot always knew. And now, the final question had set everything into motion.